Hey guys, it's me, Mr. 250, and welcome back to Banshee's Last Cry. Let's continue here after our friend Mr. Faberge got attacked by somebody who might have been Bobby, might have been just some other guy who's out here, I don't know. And we somehow ran ourselves into the inn. Good job on that one, Max. After waiting anxiously for what seemed like minutes, but was probably seconds, the door opened. Like a group of shambling Yeti, the three of us half stumbled, half walked inside. Seeing us carrying Mr. Faberge, Colleen's hand flew to her mouth in alarm. Hurry! Quick! First aid! Mr. Forrest was breathing so hard, it was all he could do to spit out those few words. For a few heartbeats, Colleen was so shocked that she didn't move. But as soon as she noticed blood on Faberge's head, she shouted behind her, Abby! Get over here now! Hurry! Abby came at once, and between her and the Forest, they managed to half-drag, half-carry Faberge into the back. Bobby closed and locked the door. Myself, I just laid on the floor, lacking the strength to even get up. Why do you think he was attacked anyway? Bobby finally said after catching his breath. I guess he must have run into the killer. I didn't want to say what I was really thinking. I was convinced that he hit him. He was struck right outside the room where the dead body is, right? Even if the killer had escaped out of the window after killing Mr. Jones, wouldn't he have turned into an ice sculpture by now, standing outside and waiting the whole time? There was no denying that, but by that point, I was suspicious of anything that came out of Bobby's mouth. I guess it's possible he just happened to come back at the right time. They say that criminals always return to the scene of the crime. I was just trying to mollify Bobby by saying the first thing that popped into my head. He seemed to jump a little too eagerly at the suggestion. That's right, exactly! The killer was on his way back here. Maybe he had some reason, picking up evidence he left behind or something. Why was this guy saying any of this? Wasn't it the one that knocked Faberge out? Or was it actually possible that the real killer was still out there? Or still another possibility. Could the killer not be Bobby? Could it be one of the other guests? Mr. Forrest? He had the opportunity to attack Faberge. Maybe he went away from me on purpose, quickly caught up with Faberge, and made his move. But even if he did have the chance, he couldn't have possibly killed Mr. Jones. He was with us all in the lounge when it happened, which meant that if the killer wasn't Bobby, he must have escaped outside. All of this was still wild speculation. We'd know a lot more once Faberge woke up. Who hit him, what he looked like. Even if we didn't get a good look at the killer's face, we'd at least get some kind of clue. Well, I'm going back to my room. Bobby stood up. You okay? Can you get up? He reached out a hand to help me. Thanks. After a little hesitation, I carefully grabbed it and pulled myself up. I followed Bobby back to his room, just to make sure that was where he actually went, and then I headed for the lounge. I didn't feel like exposing my back to a potential psychotic killer. When I reached the lounge, I noticed that only Amber and Grace were there. Where's everybody else? Mr. Buchanan went back to his room after you left. He kept saying he wanted to try his cell phone again. Oh. Tiffany's group went to the bathroom. All three of them? Yeah. And Abby's with my uncle, looking in on Mr. Faberge. Yeah, that I knew. It was then that I realized that my clothes were soaking wet from the melted snow. I'm going to get changed, I said as I headed back to my room. Oh, Mr. Buchanan. I just finished changing when I stepped out into the hallway and saw him standing nearby. Hey, it's you. Glad to see you're all right. How'd it go with the phone? The phone? Oh, you mean my cell phone, eh? Well, it's no good. Couldn't get a single bar, just like the Billy Boy said. Oh. Grace and Amber were still the only ones in the lounge. The others were probably in Faberge's room. Oomph. Mr. Buchanan came in and sat down on a sofa with an audible grunt. I figured the sofas were about to get crowded again, so I decided to sit at the table. So, how'd things go outside? Did y'all spot anything out of the ordinary? Mr. Buchanan had been in his room the whole time, so he still didn't know what had happened. Worse than that, Mr. Faberge was attacked. What the heck? Mr. Buchanan frowned. Who did it? He get away? Yeah, and none of us saw him. Just Faberge. Grace and Amber listened to our conversations, worried looks on their faces. Was he hurt, or he wanted to ask if he was killed, but couldn't bring himself to say it? I don't know. Mr. Forrest and Abby are looking after him right now, but good lord, it's just like how a coyote hunts down a herd. They just pick him off, one lamb at a time. Once again, Mr. Buchanan showed off his knack for saying the most mentally devastating thing possible. Grace and Amber suddenly looked paralyzed with fear. That's not even funny. Why would you say that? Like, seriously, what a jerk. Think about what you gotta say, bro. But Mr. Buchanan stuck to his guns. Look, darling, it just makes sense. If he kills all of us, he'll be able to sit and wait out a snowstorm with no one to bother him. On top of that, there'll be no one left to go to the cops. He'll have all the time in the world to plan his escape. But that's just horrible. Grace's face was a mask of fear. I hated to admit it, but Buchanan had a point. Running away in this weather would be suicide. It made more sense to hide somewhere safe and wait for someone to screw up. It made it far easier to explain why Faberge was jumped. Maybe Faberge was unlucky. He just happened to be the first person the killer spotted out there. Simple as that, I started to think. That Mr. Buchanan was right. But even so, I couldn't see any benefit in making Grace even more frightened than she already was. So I did my best to calm her down. We don't know if that's true, and even if it is, we'll be fine as long as we don't go outside. We just need to all stick together and make sure we're never alone. Grace immediately countered. That's easy for you to say, but we can't use our phones. How are we supposed to get help without going outside? Well, look, if we can just make it through tonight, we'll be okay. There's no way anyone can survive all night out there in this weather. But doesn't that mean he'll be desperate enough to try anything? Well, I was quickly failing in my attempt to reassure her. While we were talking, Mr. and Miss Forrest came back. Mr. Forrest, how's Faberge? Well, he's awake, but his expression was black. Was it serious? He says he didn't see a thing. Something just suddenly bashed him in the head. That explained his expression. Faberge didn't get a look at the guy. Is he okay then? Well, I'm not sure. He says he feels dizzy, so there's a chance he has a concussion. He shook his head softly and went on. I'm not a doctor, so I don't really know. But it doesn't look like his skull is fractured, so that's good. Where on his head was he hit? Grace surprised me by asking what seemed like, at first, like an odd question. Where? Around the right temple. Why do you ask? Grace thought for a minute and then said, half to herself, so he was hit on the right temple, from behind, which means the killer is right-handed. Well, I'm sure that's a great clue. Wait, we don't know for a fact that he was hit from behind. But if he was, that made Bobby even more of a suspect, I thought to myself. Right, but you said you didn't see whoever hit him. That means the attack came from behind. Grace, you're only saying that because you don't know what it was like out there. I could hardly keep my face up with all the crap flying around. Even when I did, I couldn't see one step ahead of me. But still, if the guy was right in front of him, he would have seen something, don't you think? Just as we were talking about the killer, who should come in but Bobby himself? Flustered, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. He didn't have to be in front. He could have been on the side, or above him, for all we knew. Above him? I hadn't really thought about it before saying it, but something about that idea set some bells ringing. Meanwhile, Bobby was just sitting nonchalantly on the sofa, seemingly oblivious to what we were talking about. How's Faberge doing? He asked. Well, I don't think it's too serious, but there could be some internal bleeding, so I'm not sure he's out of the woods either. Did he see who did it? Unfortunately, he said he didn't. Bobby looked relieved. Or was that just my imagination again? Oh, well, at least now we have an idea of what this maniac might try next. I think we all better stick close together. Hmm? Bobby stopped suddenly, looked around. Where are the girls? Abby's not here either. Huh? I thought she came down before me. Mr. Forrest looked confused. The girls have been in the bathroom for a long time too. I mean, I doubt anything's happened to them as a group, but still. Well, Abby sure didn't come back here. Are you sure she's not still in the staff room? Grace would know. She'd been hanging in the lounge the whole time. You don't think she went to the room with the body, do you? Mr. Forrest asked, looking increasingly concerned. The room with the body? Why would she do that? She said there was something about it that still bothered her. But I told her not to go, that it was nothing a girl should look at. I'm going to find them. Bobby stood up. I didn't let it show on my face, but inside I was a bundle of raw nerves. Should I really let him go by himself? On the other hand, I wasn't all that eager to go with a possible killer either. What should I do, I wondered. It's okay, I'll go. Besides, the girls might be sleeping. Before I could make up my mind, Grace jumped in. I was relieved, but then I had another problem. Should I go with Grace, or should I stay and keep an eye on Bobby? But again, before I could come to a decision, Grace acted first. Getting up quickly, she left the room. Suddenly, dark and terrible thoughts flashed in my mind. What if the killer mistakenly thought Faberge had seen his face? Maybe he snuck back in to finish the job. And as he was sneaking around, here comes Grace to check on the girls. She has no idea how much danger she's in. But just as I was starting to become impatient and wonder whether I should go check on things, Grace came hustling back. What's wrong? Well, the girls, they said they'd feel safer by themselves. They said they really can't trust anyone else. What's that supposed to mean? Mr. Forrest sounded shocked and a little hurt. I could tell that Grace was struggling for a way to say it delicately, without much luck. Basically, they think any one of us might be the killer. The only ones that looked surprised were Mr. and Mrs. Forrest and Amber. Presumably everyone else had already considered the thought. That's ridiculous. Why would we kill someone we didn't even know? Mr. Forrest spit out each word angrily. Well, how can you be so sure whoever it is didn't know him? Mr. Buchanan fired back. Chase, you can't be talking about. What? Heck no, Billy boy. What y'all take me for? I'm just saying whether it was me, you, or someone else. How can you be so dang sure they didn't know Jones? For all we know, they knew him real well. Mr. Forrest looked wildly around, like a cornered man. So what about the rest of you? You think so too. You think that the killer didn't run away. He's right here, among us hiding. Is that what you think? I nodded, trying my best not to look at Bobby. Mr. Forrest was plainly having a hard time wrestling with the idea that one of us was a murderer. But it's not true. It can't be true. Just think about it for a minute. Who among us even had the chance to do such a thing? Killing a man, then cutting up his body piece by piece like that. Do you have any idea how much time that would take? Well, we got half an hour, 10 minutes, which, maybe if you were like master murder chef, you just like chop, 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 chop. Maybe 10 minutes? Or we could, run over a detailed simulation in our mind. Let's just say half an hour. That sounds like a pretty good guess, right? I mean, half an hour would be enough for even somebody who wasn't experienced with it to do it, as long as they didn't hesitate too much. I didn't want to ponder over it too much. If the guy had the skill to do it, that is. Mr. Forrest nodded his head in agreement. So, did anyone have that time after dinner? Abby, Bobby, Colleen, and I were busy cleaning up. And I think most of the rest of you were here. So it makes more sense to assume it was someone from the outside, no? When the window was broken, I didn't see Bobby anywhere around. Up until now, that was enough reason for me to suspect him. But now that I thought about it, I doubted he had enough time to dismember an entire body. Dinner wrapped up at around 8 o'clock. Tiffany and the others were already talking about the killer's note. Soon after, the Buchanans came into the room. So that accounted for them, Mr. and Mrs. Forrest, and the 3 girls. Faberge arrived shortly afterwards, at around 8:30. Everyone except Bobby was together in the lounge when that glass broke. If that was definitely the case, maybe he did, just barely, have enough time to do the deed. I decided it wasn't a good time to say that right then. Wait! Suddenly, I realized that everyone had forgotten a very important point. Wait a minute. Mr. Forrest. You just said that no one here had the time to dismember the body, right? So when exactly do you think the killer actually committed the crime? When do you think he got into the inn and murdered Miss Jones? When? I have no idea, Mr. Forrest looked perplexed. Alright, forget about the time. How do you think he got in? The windows were all closed, and if he went in through the front door, wouldn't one of us have noticed? But who would have broken the window then? Colleen asked, sounding surprised. We heard the sound of the window breaking just before we discovered the body, right? And it took us about 15 minutes to get to the room where it happened. So, no matter how you think about it, there's no way the killer had the time to cut apart the body like that. That makes sense. So that means he might have entered the room without breaking the glass. Without breaking the glass? Colleen had me taken off guard with that suggestion. Yeah, maybe he opened the window and let the killer in. Mr. Jones, I mean. The victim invited the killer in? It was a crazy thought, but it wasn't implausible. It was likely the victim and the killer knew each other. In fact, as long as he didn't expect to be killed, it actually wasn't that far-fetched. If he had secretly let the killer in, it probably meant the two of them were planning something suspicious. Maybe they had a falling out? In that case, he could have snuck in any time. After dinner, before dinner. That would have given him plenty of time to kill Mr. Jones, and slice him up after he went back to his room after dinner. A look of relief seemed to have passed over Bobby's face. He probably had the idea people suspected him, despite my efforts. Hey, wait a minute. Bobby suddenly looked around anxiously, as if he remembered something. Where's Abby? Oh, putting her hand over her mouth, Grace stood up. I forgot to tell you, but I couldn't find Abby. Uh-oh. I was too scared to go in the room with the body, but I called out and nobody answered. Everyone looked at each other. If the killer came in through the window, he can always do it again. It's wide open, I said to myself in an anxious whisper. Oh my God, Abby! We gotta find her now, before she winds up in pieces too! Once again, Mr. Buchanan managed to say way too much. God, I've had it with you and your big mouth. Mr. Forrest sounded genuinely angry. We do need to find her, though. No one should be alone right now. It'd be better for all of us to stay together. The girls, too, Bobby said. I agreed completely. Let's all look for her. Make sure you don't get separated. Mr. Forrest thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, we should hurry. You got it. Once again, we got our weapons ready and went to check out the rooms. We all stood grouped together in front of Mr. Jones' room, Mr. Forrest in the center. Mr. Forrest started to open the door, but then hesitated. He probably wasn't too eager to see that gruesome corpse again. So you just called out to see if she was in there, he asked, looking at Grace. Grace nodded, and with a resigned sigh, Mr. Forrest turned the doorknob. The rush of cold air was shocking. Abby? You in there? The only answer was the howling of the wind. Gripping his ski pole, Mr. Forrest peeked into the bathroom. The rest of us stood guard outside. Step by fearful step, Mr. Forrest made his way to where the corpse lay, and after taking a quick look, came back out. No dice. Mr. Forrest, come quick! Bobby called out from the hallway. What is it? Ruby. Bobby stood at the end of the hallway, pointing at the closet we'd looked in earlier. Standing in front of it and meowing loudly was Ruby, the black cat. Mr. Forrest tiptoed softly in that direction. Ruby noticed us and started crying even louder. Mr. Forrest put his hand on the doorknob and stopped. What's the big deal? It's just a little kitty crying. They already checked it, Mr. Buchanan grumbled to himself, but no one was listening. Uh-oh. Mr. Forrest opened the door. Inside was Abby. Her body had been bent up and stuffed inside like some kind of grisly puppet. Her eyes were wide open, staring at us in frozen shock. But they saw nothing. Doll eyes. Dead eyes. Abby. Bobby's whispered voice broke the shocked silence. Mr. Forrest hurriedly took Abby's hand and narrowed his eyes in concentration as he felt for a pulse. Finally, he looked up at us and slowly, silently shook his head. It can't be, Bobby cried, his lips quivering. No, it can't be! It can't be! Bobby howled like a man who'd lost his mind. Then he grabbed hold of Abby's lifeless body and began to sob. Abby! Abby! Abby had been beaten to death. Her skull was smashed in, and her long hair was clumped and matted with blood. Oh my god. Grace gripped my arm, her nails digging deep. Her face was twisted with emotion, and tears of fear and grief welled up in her eyes. Bobby picked up the mop handle up off the floor and stood. "Come out, you murdering man! I'll kill you!" Screaming so loud it sounded like he would tear his vocal cords, Bobby walked down the hall, pounding on the walls and doors. "Bobby, stop it!" Mr. Forrest tried to get a hold of him, but Bobby shook him off violently. "Abby! Abby!" Bobby suddenly stopped in the middle of the hallway, collapsed to his knees, and began to sob. The victims up to this point, Mr. Jones and Faberge, were nothing more than one-time visitors. None of us really knew them. Part of us still saw all of this as something happening to other people. It didn't completely touch us. But Abby was different. For the Forrest and Bobby, a close friend had been brutally murdered. And judging by the way Bobby reacted, he and Abby might have been more than just friends. The dismembered corpse of Mr. Jones created fear and anxiety, but Abby's death filled us with unspeakable anger and heart-wrenching grief. Grace. What? Go and convince the girls to come out. I'm going to check on Faberge. Without waiting for a reply, I went to Faberge's door and opened it. Faberge was lying in bed, his head wrapped in bandages. His face was pale and his eyes were closed, making him look more dead than alive. Faberge. He had been sleeping, but opened his eyes and let out a groan when I called his name. "I think it would be safer if we all stayed together. If you can, I'd like you to join us in the lounge. Can you walk?" I don't know. Just getting up seemed to be causing him a lot of pain. "Let me give you a hand." Thanks. Faberge lowered his feet off the floor and stood up groggily. Off the bed, yeah. I think I can make it. Slowly, shakily, he started to walk. Exiting the room, we found everyone except the three girls waiting for us in the hallway. "Let's go to the lounge for the time being," I said, looking them all in the eye. On the way to the stairs, Mr. Forrest gave me a hand with Faberge. "Thanks," I said lightly. Looking towards the end of the hallway, Mr. Forrest murmured, "Just give them some time alone." I followed his gaze to where Bobby was still slumped on his knees near the lifeless body of Abby McCarthy. "Okay, everyone, let's get back to the lounge." The three of us led the way, followed by Grace, Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan, and finally Colleen. Slowly, we made our way downstairs. So, another body, and the killer is obviously still out there. It was probably about 5 minutes. Everyone just sat in stunned silence. Finally, Bobby showed up. He wasn't crying any longer, but his eyes were red and swollen. On his back, the ruined head of Abby McCarthy was visible. He was carrying her gently, almost like a father giving a child a piggyback ride. Everyone was silent as they watched. No one spoke a word. No one offered to help. But it wasn't because they didn't care. That was because we just knew somehow that Bobby didn't want any help. Don't ask me how we knew. You could just feel it. Quietly, Bobby crossed the room in front of us and disappeared. He was bringing Abby back to her room for the final time. He returned to the lounge sooner than I expected. His face seemed changed. On it, I could see a kind of fierce determination. "All right." I stopped and cleared my throat lightly. "We're all here together now." Heads bobbed briefly in acknowledgement. "From this point on, none of you should be alone in any circumstances. When you need to use the bathroom, use the one on this floor. If you have to go to your room for some reason, I want you to go with at least one other person." "I'm sorry, but what just happened?" Debbie spoke up in a frightened voice. She still hadn't heard the news. Abby was... Someone beat her. I couldn't say any more, but I guess they could tell from the look on my face. All three girls gasped, and then Tiffany, as usual, started to cry. The girls clung tightly to each other, closer than even than before, and seemed to be trying to stay as far away from the rest of us as possible. Faber stared at me with his mouth wide open. How did it happen? Did she go out alone? He looked like a man who suddenly found himself on a strange new planet. No, she was inside, but... I knew it! I want to go back to our room! Let us go! Cried Tiffany hysterically. No, we need to all stay together. Why? This has nothing to do with us! Just leave us alone! I guess they thought that they would be safer barricaded together in their own room. I'm sorry, but that's not going to work. I was hoping I wouldn't have to say this, but I guess I have no choice. At the time Abby was killed, the only ones that weren't here the rest of us were you three and Faberge. So what? Tiffany said, confused. So that means there's at least the possibility that one of you killed Abby. It wasn't only the girls in Faberge that looked shocked. Are you crazy, Max? You think one of the girls could have done that to Abby? Hearing Grace scream like me like that stung, but I continued on. Alone, it might be hard, yeah. One of the other girls might have noticed, but if it was all three together... Everyone in the room looked uneasily at the girls. You must be joking. How can you say that? You're horrible. Debbie stared at me with an angry, wounded look on her face. Hold on a second. I'm just saying it's a possibility. Like I said, Faberge was near there too. He also had the opportunity. Faberge let out an exhausted sigh. I was knocked out on painkillers until you came in, Max. Besides, my head is throbbing so bad I can hardly walk. I answered him calmly. Well, no offense, but you could be faking it. Hang on, don't get defensive. The point I'm trying to make is that if we want to prevent any further victims, we should all stay together. The killer might be right here among us. He might be hiding somewhere in the inn, or he might be out there in the storm watching us. I listed all the possibilities I could think of. But whatever the truth is, if we're all together, the killer won't be able to act. Or at least it'll be harder for him to act. And, let's see. Yeah, we'll stop right there, and we will continue from there next time. Another dead body, and the story is definitely coming along. It's actually, like, each individual route is actually a fairly short story, especially considering that, we're at 2 hours now about. I would say maybe roughly there's another hour or two left in the story that we're going to be doing. But there are a bunch of other paths. Now, keep in mind, let's say for another path might be another 2 hours of the main story path, and then it veers off for 5 minutes. So we're a pretty decent amount of way through the game, actually, surprisingly. Just, at least in terms of editing it, I will still have to skip through a lot of text, but in terms of editing it, we are a decent amount through the game. And, it's fun. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!